Peace, peace. Barghani, Islam, Salam, Hetepu, Rahubat, Gino Lako Nani, Chief Noble Bandele El-Amin back again for another video. And today's video, we're going to be discussing the prophet of Moorish Science Temple, which is Noble Drew Ali. And the question really is going to be today, who is Noble Drew Ali? And what I'll be dealing with is information that is not your regular information on Noble Drew Ali. And so this may reveal some different information or light on what we know or who we know as Noble Drew Ali. Okay, so with that being said, I'd like to get into our information. Please, you can check out my information. My phone number. If you'd like to make a donation to what we're doing with the Moorish Science Temple or the Moorish Temple of New Kemet and the Rites of Passage program, please donate to Bandele 227. You can email me if you have any questions, and also please look at indigenousservices.webs.com. It is the one-stop shop for your indigenous and lawful needs. And also, with that being said, please check out the books that I have published. Books by Bandele El-Amin. I have several books dealing with Moors and indigenous history, indigenous religious service systems. I got the Indigenous Manual for Life, Nationality, Birthright, Jurisprudence, basically the blueprint. And I have other books as well. But you can find all of these books by Bandele Yobachi El-Amin or Bandele El-Amin on Amazon.com. Okay, so you can see some of these, maybe a book or two is out of print. And we also got the Holy Quran. And also, if you go to Moorish, if you put in Moorish Temple New Kemet, you also find our spiritual religious book on the ancestral book. Okay, so you can also check that book out as well. But let's get into the discussion for today, because we're talking about Noble Drew Ali. And when we talk, like, for the Moors, a lot of people who are Moors, a lot of people who have gotten into the knowledge, a lot of people who are Islamic have ran across Noble Drew Ali. If you look at the Nation of Islam, I've seen several videos where, like, even Farrakhan is discussing Noble Drew Ali. Noble Drew Ali is the precursor to a lot of the Nation of Islam. It is one of the earlier movements of Islam with melanated people, what you guys call African Americans or whatnot. It is the early histories of Islam in the melanated American lifestyle. Okay, so Noble Drew Ali is an important person in Islamic, or just what you so-called Black history. But not much is known about Noble Drew Ali. And I can almost tell you that you hear the same thing from everybody who talks about Noble Drew Ali. It's like just a certain way. So, just to look a little bit at Noble Drew Ali, we're gonna look at this. We're gonna let's see, Timothy. So when we look at it, like, when you look at Noble Drew Ali, the first thing they're gonna tell you is his name is Timothy Drew. Okay, better known as Noble Drew Ali. Okay, was an American who founded the Moorish Science Temple of America. That's important. 1913 founded the Canaanite Temple. This is all things that we're told when we go into it. It says that it talks about him going to New Jersey, then relocating to Chicago, this and that, all the way up to the following the murder of somebody in his temple, and he got arrested but never was charged for it. Then he was released, but he died. Now that's the early thing. But like when they talk about his life, They talk about he's from North Carolina. They say that he's the orphan son of two former slaves, born of a Cherokee tribe. Okay, so they talk about he's part of a tribe, and which kind of links him. This Cherokee tribe kind of links him to what they call the Washita. Okay, they say that he got a lot of the knowledge. They say that he went off a version. See, you say this version. So I mean, there's versions of what we know about Noble Drew Ali. There's not a consensus. Okay, but this is the version that you hear about most. That he joined with a band of Romani people, went overseas. Some people say that he was in the circus and wound up going overseas. So they're saying that he went over to Egypt, Middle East, worked as a circus magician before purportedly traveling to Egypt. Okay, he never received any formal education, but at some point he came into Eastern philosophy. Okay, this is the general consensus when you talk about Noble Drew Ali. When you look him up, you'll find that this is what you'll see, and this is what I was taught in the nation as of Moors as well in the temple. Okay, but I would like to say that there's a book that discusses a lot of Islam. This book is the history of conversion to Islam in the United States. So this book, volume 2, it talks about what they call Muslim minorities. Now we know the minorities, what that means, whatnot, but we're not talking about in the context of what they're discussing. We have Muslim minorities, the book, and it's like it says, the history of conversion to Islam in the United States, volume 2. So if you look, it says the African American Islamic Renaissance. So this is about the African American Renaissance of Islam from 1920 to 1975. So this 1920s is going to include, Noble Drew Ali. It's going to include Wadaf D. Muhammad or Wally D. Ford, whatever you want to call him. It's going to talk about Elijah Muhammad, Clarence 13X, whatever. You know what I'm saying? And so we're going to look, because we're talking about Noble Drew Ali today, and I'm going to use this book. I just wanted you to see, the text in which it comes from. I mean, so if you need to do your own research. And what I wanted to say, and I want to show you kind of what it goes over. So, I mean, it starts back, to what they call 1619, the origin of Americanized slavery. And like I said, it talks about the transformation, Allah coming to America. Because, I mean, first of all, before I get into all that, we know that Islam had came over with the slaves. I mean, there were a few slaves. There were many slaves who were Islamic, who, when they came over here, they could speak, they could read the Quran, all that. We got the Prince of Slaves, all them, they were all Islamic in a sense. Okay, so Islam started back then as far as the cultures, and so they discussed that. But as you see, they go through Noble Drew Ali first, the Moorish Temple of America. Then they go do W.D. Fard, okay, the Nation of Islam, smaller sects and independent mystics. And that's when they get to talk about like different people, okay? But what we're going to discuss is Noble Drew Ali, and it's on page 159. So we're going to go to page 159 and discuss Noble Drew Ali. And we're going to look at what, let's see, 159. So we're going to discuss what Noble Drew Ali, okay, we get to him now. We're going to discuss what Noble Drew Ali was really about, because when I read this, y'all, I mean, like it kind of, and it kind of took me back. Now, this is not to tear down Noble Drew Ali at any cost. Okay, Noble Drew Ali is a prophet of Moorish Temple. This is not to destroy or to defame or anything of that nature about Noble Drew Ali. Okay, Noble Drew Ali is a respected ancestor elder in the Temple of New Kemet. Okay, so this is not slander on anybody, but we like to do investigation, and there's not a lot of knowledge on Noble Drew Ali. And so I want to give this as background and drop so there's more of information out there about him for us to look at. Okay. So it talks about Garvey, because Garvey is important to all these movements, if you know. Okay. Noble Drew Ali and Garvey are linked in some form and fashion. Okay. But let's get down into this. So we all know Noble Drew Ali. We talk about the prophet. It says after decades of journalists, government agents, scholars, and amateur researchers shifting through numerous records and interviewing members of his religious community, the background of this man known as Noble Drew Ali remains clouded, as we say, by conflicting and unverified stories. For close to 90 years, the almost universally accepted narrative was that Drew Ali, who was said to be born Timothy Drew, January 8th, 1886, North Carolina, started his Islamic movement, which according to some accounts originally was called the Canaanite Temple, yada, yada, yada. And this is basically what we read when we went to Wikipedia, the basic information that everybody has, okay? But now, look at before we get into this, they interviewed people who was in the temple. They did a lot of research to find more out about Noble Drew Ali, okay? So this is why this became of an interest to me, this article, okay? It says that, now check it out. It says there are rumors that had added further hints about his past. So you got these rumors. One of them, for instance, is recorded by a graduate student in the 1960s. He was that Drew Ali had been arrested for fortune telling in New York in July 26, 1916. So in Newark, he was arrested, allegedly arrested for fortune telling, which is something I never really knew about Noble Drew Ali. I did not know that he at any point in his life had been dealing with fortune telling. So this gives a little bit of insight on what people was thinking, at least what people was thinking about Noble Drew Ali, if this is not actual correct. But it was, like you said, it was coming from a recorded graduate student. Okay. However, other rumors recorded in the late 1930s indicated that his group, Great Seal. So this is another thing, because we talk about the Great Seal. The Great Seal is an important title. Okay, so it says the Great Seal contained on it claimed that the group was founded not in 1913, but in 1916 on May Day, May 1st. Okay, so that is also something that I did not know. We're always told 1913. We're always told in Newark, New Jersey, started the Canaanite Temple. But they're saying that, and despite the fact that Drew Ali was routinely said to have been raised in North Carolina, only his relatives from Virginia were reported as having sent him money into the 1920s. These and several other stories remain fragmented and unverified for dozens of years. Okay, so these are things that had been floating around for years, but it wasn't until what they're saying into 2014. However, a researcher, Brother Ali Abdat, by using some digital genealogical archives, located relevant census and draft records and city directories, and in doing so, completely transformed the field's knowledge of the MSTA founder. Okay, Abdat convincingly demonstrated that although he was indeed born in January, okay, so that's the right date, but Drew Ali's birth name was Thomas and not Timothy. So his name was Thomas Drew, and that he had spent the majority of his childhood and much of his early adulthood in Virginia, not in North Carolina. So Thomas Drew was raised by his adoptive parents, most likely Uncle and Aunt James Washington and Drew and Lucy Drew. Okay. Now remember that they do got these files on FBI files on Noble Drew Ali, when they were investigating him. So a lot of this information has not really been put out there. So now it says that although he primarily worked as a longshoreman, James Washington Drew was probably also a pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church, and thus may have been from him that Thomas initially developed the taste for organized religion. It's possible. I mean, it's not proof, but it's possible. It says that the records uncovered by Abdat, however, cannot place Thomas in Newark in 1913, where he supposedly established his temple. Instead, the extract documents tell us that in 1910 he was working as a longshoreman in Norfolk, and in 1916 he was employed as a porter in Richmond. The earliest Abdat could document Thomas' presence in Newark was 1917, at which time he was a laborer for the Submarine Boat Corporation, a subsidiary of the Electric Boat Company. But by the following year, Thomas had moved into a home at 181 Warren Street. Now, this is important, on 181 Warren Street, from where he began working, according to the 1920 census, as a street preacher. So in the 1920 census, he had been in Newark as a street preacher. Now, when they say it like that, you think that he's dealing in Christianity. Okay, so we can read into that. Whatever it is that we come up with as our definition for preacher. But as I said, a preacher to me is someone who's basically, a Christian minister of some sort. Now it says from 1918, 1920 data is extremely important in tracing Drew Ali's past, as certain key elements of it are consistent with not only some of the old rumors, okay, but also information found on copies of undated business cards or advertisement containing a picture of a man who looks very much like Drew Ali of Chicago, which numerous Moorish Americans and certain federal agents had obtained by the 1940s. The card reads as follows. It says, Professor Drew, Egyptian adept student. Hours, between 10 and 12, and then 6 to 8 p.m. At where? 181 Warren. So this preacher, known as Thomas Drew, at some point, was had moved into 181 Warren. Now, what's important, and a lot of Moors and people who know this, is that he did go by Professor Drew, but there are letters that we always read that talk about him being an Egyptian adept student. So if this is not Noble Drew Ali, then there's very similar concepts being brought up by somebody that was just like him, had the last name. Okay. And then he goes and says that I am a Muslim. Professor Drew is a man who was born with divine power. He was taught by the adepts of Egypt. I have a secret of destroying the germs of tuberculosis and cancer of the lungs in 10 to 30 days. Your lung cancer ended. A very strict examination that the germs are entirely destroyed. Also, I can destroy the germs of cancer, gout, rheumatism, lumago, heart trouble, yada, yada, yada. So, in the early stages before, I didn't know this, Noble Drew Ali was out, curing or allegedly curing illnesses, known as a healer. So Noble Drew Ali is taking on some of your, I guess, prophetic characteristics or messianic characteristics by doing this. Now, I'm not, this is not to say that he was or not a Messiah or anything, but it's just showing that historically that Noble Drew Ali was also known as a healer. Okay. It says that now, it says one can see here that this man used by the name of Drew, that he worked out of 181 Street in Newark, and that he claimed to possess spiritual or mythical knowledge. All characteristics that are consistent with what we know about Thomas Drew through Abbat's research, and are generally consistent with what we know about Drew Ali, which is true. Now, the fact that on this card, the man claims to be a Muslim. Now, they got Muslim, but it said on the card, Muslim with an M-O-S. Although not a Moor. So you didn't, like we said, you didn't see any Moorish, like any Moorish literature or anything prescribing to being a Moor in that document, or in his early time, in his earlier part of his journey. You didn't see that Moor part. Okay, it says that Moor, not a Moor, only helps solidify its connection to the leader of the MST of A. The story of Drew Ali pre-MST of A life can be fleshed out even more by bringing into the picture the rumor that he had been arrested for fortune-telling in Newark in the summer of 1916. A check of Newark's newspaper of 1916 revealed that Thomas Drew, or rather Dr. Thomas Drew, the Newark-based mystic who also mentioned earlier, claimed at the time to have been East Indian born in Virginia. Okay, so Drew Lee was talking about he was an East Indian born in Virginia, and who mixed black folk tradition with modern occult knowledge. So it has been known that Noble Drew Ali dabbled in what we call occult or hidden knowledge that was not necessarily Christian or Islamic. Okay, and the fact that he's claiming to be Indian, it gives himself an even more mysterious or a more of a mystic identification with people. Okay, so, and like we say, we don't see anything about Moors or anything of that nature at this time. It says that the mixed born, okay, it says that he was indeed arrested in Newark that year, but not on June 26th. But no, it says, but on June 26th, not July. So what happens is the rumor had got it wrong as far as the date. Now they knew he was arrested for fortune telling, but they were off by 1 month. Okay. Now it says, despite the difference between the rumor date and historical record of Dr. Thomas Drew, two sets of evidence suggest to a degree of near certainty that Noble Drew Ali was identical with the East Indian mystic. The first set is the Newark newspaper references to Dr. Thomas Drew in 1916 and 17. The single most important fact taken from this collection of newspaper articles is the fact that Dr. Thomas Drew's arrest record, his arrest in 1916 occurred when undercover detectives observed him telling their fortunes. Officially, the charges was practicing medicine without a license and using witchcraft. So, I mean, like, they try to charge. That's funny, to have a charge back then for practicing witchcraft. That's hilarious. But he was charged with practicing medicine, which we have seen in our time. We've seen, like, Dr. Sabi, how he was charged with practicing medicine in a sense when he was out here, telling people he could cure things. So, I mean, in the same aspect, it looks like Noble Drew Ali was out here being a mystic and saying that he was, curing, he could cure things that were not necessarily curable in Western tradition or in the United States. And they called him out on it. And they were saying that he out here practicing, and he got caught by undercover. So he was practicing on an undercover, and they caught him. Okay. Now it says that reports further reveal claim to be specialized in healing and able to escape any type of capture, both of which were similar claims that were used by Noble Drew Ali. So I didn't really know this about Noble Drew Ali either, that, Noble Drew Ali had taken on, like, I won't say magic, but when I think of that, being able to escape, it just puts me in a time. It seemed like back then in the 1920s, in the 30s, you had like Harry Houdini or something like that, which were, entertainment, common entertainment, like David Blaine today, but, seemed like more popular back then. So Noble Drew Ali kind of taking on the popularity of not being able to be captured by being able to break out of handcuffs, or like you could tie him up and stuff and throw him in the water and he'll get out the chains, things like that. Those are things that were popular back then. It says that one newspaper article even noted that Dr. Drew business hours were 10 in the morning to noon and 6 to 8 in the evening, and it referred to him explicitly as Professor Drew and as the Egyptian adept student. The precise hours and terms used by the professor on his card. So that's that similarity. Finally, it should be taken into account that the Newark Evening News contains no reference to any other man named Drew who was arrested for similar charges. And there is currently no evidence that there were any other fortune tellers or mystics named Drew. Okay, so, I mean, despite the name being slightly changed, the first name, everything else seems to add up with Noble Drew Ali in that time. It says that a second set of evidence is the second collection of Newark newspaper articles. These articles, which appeared in 1920 to 23, discussed the same Dr. Thomas Drew, who was arrested in Newark in 1916. In fact, that earlier arrest and Drew's subsequent sentence was repeatedly brought up in the 1920 articles. The identification of the 1916 Dr. Thomas Drew with the 1920 Dr. Thomas Drew is crucially important because 1916 Thomas Drew appeared neither claimed to be a Muslim nor resided in 181 Warren Street, whereas Dr. Drew of 1920 did. So, I mean, so what we're saying, basically from 1916, there had been some kind of change in Drew and Dr. Drew or Noble Drew Ali. It had been some change in his ideology, which made him, and to keep it real, people don't want to look at it maybe like this, but I've seen many a time where people in a span of 3, 4 years, they have changed how they identify themselves because they're looking and they're coming up with more information and knowledge, and then they solidify certain things as and it doesn't take long when you're really looking for this information and studying. So it's not, to me, too far-fetched that him being able to do that. So so looking at Drew Ali, it says, with this established, we can treat that the Newark newspaper descriptions about and claims of Thomas Drew as some of the earliest known such artifacts concerning Noble Drew Ali, and therefore as crucial pieces of information understanding his pre-MSTA life. According to the news reports, in June 1916, Drew Ali had been operating what he called his occult office in 22 School Street for at least several weeks, during which time he had been demonstrating magical powers and had given mystical advice to hundreds. Although the business cards he handed out during this period stated that he would read a person's future for free, once visitors arrived, he typically charged them at least $1 to perform his various services. Fortune telling, which he did using a crystal ball placed upon a piece of black velvet, was one of his cheapest powers. Another was the eating of several nails in one sitting. For those who were interested in seeing live performances of some of his amazing escapes, acts recently popularized by C. Harry Houdini. Drew Ali also broke locks, escaped from handcuffs, and bent iron bars. Items he supplied himself for the performance in a manner typical of magicians who perform similar escape acts. Now, I want to say something real quick. I mean, I just want to intervene because when we look at what Noble Drew Ali was doing in the earlier part of his life, as a spiritual mystic, it is like setting him up to be very similar to like other prophets or messiahs, for example. And I'm not saying that this in the comparison that he's Jesus or anything, but when you look at like Jesus did magic. He performed these different things in front of people. Okay, and like the story of Jesus, you can see in this narrative that, which is independent of the MST of A, that he was practicing miracle type things in front of people. Okay, so I mean, that's just my thought on it. But it says that his expensive feats, however, were those dealing with the healing. Drew Ali claimed that he could cure, according to the Evening News, aches, pains, fevers, consumptions, yada, 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 bronchitis, yada, yada, yada. He was able to perform such feats. Drew Ali insisted that either breathing on the afflicted or passing on them the magnetic influences of his blood in his blood, thereby killing the germs. The mystic's single most expensive cure was the injections of all evil spirits influences from an individual, giving them the ability to sleep at night at peace. So, he was saying that he could do all these different things. The available evidence suggests that in 1916, Drew Ali was not claiming any connection to Islam, but rather identifying with folk religion, occultism, and non-Islamic Oriental themes. In addition to stating that he was an East Indian from Virginia and an Egyptian adept student, as noted in the reports from the period, indicated that Drew Ali said that he was born with a second sight and that he later cultivated his skills through the combination of travel to India. So he focuses back then more on going to India versus him saying he was going to Egypt. And there's another thing that he said in here when he talks about that he'd rather deal with folk religion. Well, I mean, what is folk religion? What is folk religion? Like, when I think of folk religion, I often think of like a hoodoo or something. So what is folk religion? And that is, listen.
Or cultural religious practice that falls outside the doctrine of organized religion.
Right. Okay, so basically what Google's saying is that folk religion is an ethnic or cultural religious practice that falls outside the doctrine of organized religion. Okay, so folk religion could be like hoodoo or anything like that. So, I mean, it's interesting that he is identified with folk religion, occultism, not necessarily Islam, which to me, you can tell in the Sacred Southern Quran that it's mostly folk, it's mostly occultism, things that are not necessarily known in your regular organized religion. New Age. Okay, so his whole thing about traveling to India talks about him traveling to India with the Indian yogis. None of them claims that suggest a distinct Islamic identity. Furthermore, instead of wearing a fez or a turban, as is well known to do in public in the late 1920s, at that time, it says Drew Ali was garbed in what was described as loosely fitting, multicolored gown, a brilliant purple hood covering his head. Again, nothing noting an overtly Islamic identity. However, it is possible that Drew Ali was undergoing an identity change at the time. After failing to use his powers to free himself from a local jail while awaiting trial for his recent charges, Drew Ali indicated that several years before he had been attacked by what was he called a brainstorm while he was at Basking Ridge, roughly 25 miles from Newark. Prior to the brainstorm, Drew Ali had been an untamed spirit that jails, straitjackets, or handcuffs could not hold. But the incident apparently left him sapped of his abilities, even forcing him to use a crystal ball to straighten his eyes. If nothing else, the arrest was forcing Drew Ali to temper his claims of mystical power. So, they're saying like, he went to jail. Maybe some of that stuff was not exactly what it was supposed to be. And, he had to come to reality and maybe look another direction. Okay. So it says that a month later, after his June 16 arrest, Ali was convicted for practicing medicine without a license and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Didn't know that. Although it is not entirely clear how much of that sentence he actually served. In any case, when he reappeared in 1920, it was learned by police that the healer had been very active over the past few years and had accumulated patients in every big city in the East. As described in Chapter 2, by the time Drew Ali, although he was still focused on healing people and was apparently still wearing a robe and hood and not a suit and fez, he would later typically wear, now was claiming to be a Muslim, not an East Indian. Drew Ali teachings may have changed by this point as well. This is suggested that by the fact that it was only in 1920 that he recorded with making references to probably being Muslim. To horoscopes, saying that he had raised the dead, refusing to take oaths, insisting that healing comes for African Americans only through belief in both him and their God, and attempting to sell a book he would continue to use through the MST of A period, that he described as containing the 18 years of Christ's life that is silent to your Holy Bible, which is undoubtedly Dowing's Aquarian Gospel. His practices seem to have shifted too. Whereas in 1916 he had healed people by breathing on them and passing magnetic influences into their blood, but in 1920 he repeatedly employed water, oil, laying of hands, and previously described chanting in the inner chamber. Despite these changes, however, Drew Ali was brought to court yet again. Yet again, this time for 2 false pretense charges, a set of larceny charges, and collecting fees for health services charges. It was perhaps due to these legal troubles and the healer's almost inevitable incarceration in 1921 that Suleiman was probably able to snatch up several of Drew Ali's believers in the following years. The only currently available additional piece of contemporary evidence we have for Drew Ali's activities before MST of A was established in Chicago in a single newspaper article in December 1923, where it was indicated as mentioned